Today, I'm going to be talking about scouting and a whole bunch of stuff related to pest management, specifically focused a little bit more on diversified vegetable systems, but also trying to provide a general framework for how you'd manage pests in most situations. So as an outline of what we're going to be talking about today, first, I want to talk a little bit about sort of my philosophical approach to managing insect pests, because I think it's kind of useful moving forward for how you manage all these sorts of different things. That's a good starting point. Then I'm going to be talking about integrated pest management overall and some different techniques that are used in it. I'll be spending a bit more time on pest ID and scouting because I feel that's really the bedrock of integrated pest management. And there's a couple very useful tools and techniques that I would like to introduce people to if they're not aware of them. We'll then talk about other parts of IPM, cultural control, natural enemies, biocontrol, and also a little bit about how to use organic pesticides in combination with other things. And then at the end, we'll finish up with some examples of all these techniques being used together. And then finally, where to find more information about all of this, because you becoming an expert in your own system is, of course, the most important and critical thing you can do. And again, this is me sort of trying to walk the line between going too specific and not necessarily providing information you need, and going too broad and not providing particularly useful information. So my general goal here is to try to provide you with a framework and additionally some tools for managing any different kind of pest you encounter. So basically, what is your general approach and what are some things that are universally and very broadly applicable? So first and foremost, for sort of my philosophy about pest management, I'm going to go to sort of an odd place, which is Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass. And here, Alice is encountering the Red Queen, and the Red Queen is explaining the rules of this strange land to Alice, and she says here, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And if you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. And I think I really like this because I think it illustrates, interestingly, a really important principle about pest management. And actually, this is called the Red Queen hypothesis and is used in evolutionary biology as well. But what this is with this Red Queen scenario is basically this sense that pests will consistently adapt to control methods. And this is especially true if you're relying solely on one control method and specifically solely on insecticides. So essentially, you'll take all the running you can do just to stay in the same place when it comes to pest management if you're only relying on one thing. And there's a couple great examples of this with Colorado potato beetle or western flower thrips, where these are very notable examples of insects that become rapidly resistant to a whole bunch of different pesticides that are used against them. Obviously, you want to avoid the Red Queen scenario as much as you can when you are a grower. And the way you do this to avoid sort of running in the same place is you use techniques that are hard for the pest to adapt to and/or techniques that adapt with the pest. And additionally, you're going to basically always be using multiple techniques based on a strong knowledge of both the pest and the growing system that you have at hand. So this is not a way to completely avoid the Red Queen scenario. You basically never can, but it is a very good way to mitigate it to a much greater degree and to prevent sort of shooting yourself in the foot and causing problems later on. Additionally, organic ag often forces you to do this because you can't just rely on pesticides nearly to the same degree. So definitely be taking advantage of it. And generally speaking, if you are practicing organic ag, don't just be doing conventional ag, but with your hands tied because you have fewer tools when it comes to different pesticides. Instead, embrace this. Embrace using those multiple different techniques and really embrace trying to do much more knowledge-based pest management, because ultimately it's something that will be much more effective for you. Okay, so what does knowledge-based pest management look like? What are the different things we're doing when we are trying to avoid the Red Queen scenario? Well, the integrated pest management pyramid, I think, is really one of the best ways to view this, and certainly the best way to look at all these different techniques together. So when you're looking at this pyramid, basically the lower down on the pyramid you are and the bigger the block of piece that we're talking about is indicative of the amount of effort and time that you should be spending on that section. So at the very bottom, we have identification, scouting, and monitoring. That's the basis of all IPM. You need to know your pests, and you need to know when they are present in order to do anything else to make any other sorts of decisions about how to manage them. Additionally, then we have cultural control, prevention, and sanitation. And these are usually preventative measures that are quite basic and usually quite old, but also are extremely powerful and are oftentimes very difficult for pests to adapt to. So these are things you want to be doing both to prevent pests and also to manage them even once they're there. Next up, we have biological control, which is using beneficial organisms. You can do that both passively and actively. So you can have a system that sort of does biocontrol on its own, or there's something where you sometimes have to be continually inputting things, kind of like you would with pesticides. And then we also have chemical control, because of course, even in organic agriculture, pesticides are definitely a part of integrated pest management too, and need to be thought of and integrated into the system as well. And finally, sort of overarching all of this is something that I also like to add in, because I think it really is important, which is shifting your perspective as much as possible and sort of changing how you view things, which I think is often fundamentally important to practicing good IPM. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. But let's start at the base of the pyramid: identification, scouting, and monitoring. So when it comes to this, pest ID obviously is one of the biggest and most important things you have to be able to do, because if you don't know what's causing the problem, it is obviously going to be much harder to manage. And additionally, your treatments could be ineffective, or you might even be harming yourself by hurting, say, beneficial insects or other arthropods out there that might be helping you otherwise. Those could be pollinators, those could be predators or natural enemies. As an example of this, we have this insect pictured in the upper right. I have this in my presentations often because I will get people who send me pictures asking what this strange and terrible pest they have in their garden is. And of course, it's not a pest. This is a lacewing, which is a beneficial predator, which feeds on a number of different pests and is something you would like to have around. So broadly speaking, when we talk about pest ID, it's really useful to sort of be able to see the different large categories that pests may fall into. So as you can probably tell from this, I'm going to be talking basically exclusively about insect and arthropod pests. That does, of course, apply to other things. But when we're talking about insect and arthropod pests, sucking insects, for example, if you go out and you see damage that looks like dying patches, some distorted tissue on your plants, or the presence of sooty mold, then broadly speaking, you know that you're going to be dealing with things like aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, scales, or potentially things also like stink bugs. If you go out and you look at your plants and you see damage from, say, chewing insects, things like holes in the leaves or hollowed out sections or areas where things have been clearly sort of cleared away, then you're probably dealing with caterpillars, beetles, grubs, or also things like potentially slugs or snails. And finally, if you go out and you think maybe you might have mites or thrips, what you'd be looking for are dying patches, sort of similar to you might have with sucking insects, and also distorted tissue, but without the presence of sooty mold and with slightly different patterning. When you have stuff like this, that's the damage associated with spider mites, areophid mites, or things like thrips as well. So that's very useful for kind of getting a broad idea of what it is you're dealing with. But of course, we oftentimes need to go more specific than that, and we usually need more additional tools to help us with that. So the question being, what are some of these different tools that work well for pest ID? And I want to talk a little bit about magnification, because you'll often need that, and also some different insect ID apps, which can be very useful for people who are looking for a little bit of help with ID. So let's start off first with different magnifiers. Both this and the insect ID apps are something I have a whole other talk dedicated to, so this is just a very small snippet of it. But basically, for good pest ID, you often need to take good pictures. And when you're trying to take pictures of it, your phones or most other cameras, unless they're quite specialized, are rarely up to the task. And so as an example, this is a picture I got from one of my colleagues asking me, what is this pest on this leaf? And it's not as though this is a bad picture per se, but it's simply very, very difficult to actually see what things are without magnification. So you can get a general idea what it is, but you do want to be able to magnify things. And that's great both for your own purposes and if you send off pictures for identification help. There are a number of inexpensive and generally accessible options. Basically breaking out a whole bunch of stuff that I did. One of the things I found most useful are phone camera scopes. So the one that's pictured here, I actually use pretty frequently just out and about in the field. This is about $37, I think, total, and there's some that are even cheaper at about $20. It basically clips onto your phone, goes over your phone camera, and allows you to take pictures very, very close of different insects that you might encounter. So as an example, here is an insect that I found on my hand. This is as close as my phone can get. Obviously, it's going to be very, very difficult to ID this, but then when I took a picture using the phone camera scope pictured here, this is what you can see. And you can see, oh, this is actually a parasitoid wasp and something that could be beneficial for helping me with my aphid problem. So it actually has quite good magnification. You can take quite good videos or pictures or stuff with this. Additionally, there's other things like handheld digital scopes. There's a number of different examples. Dynolite is one brand that I've tried out, but there's other ones that are also available. Generally, what I found is buying about one up from the cheapest option is usually kind of that happy middle ground where it's not too expensive and it fits most people's needs, but it also is a little bit higher quality. So these are a little bit more expensive, around $200 or so. You have to connect it to a computer, but here you can get very high quality images, videos, and you can get a lot closer. So if you're more serious about pest ID and you have the money and space for it, something like this can be quite useful, and it's pretty small and portable. You can also, if you have a microscope, take a picture through that. You can also hold a hand lens up to your phone camera and try to take pictures with that. Both of these are a little bit tricky, but they are additional options. But I would say, if anything here, I would highly recommend the phone camera scope for anyone looking at pest ID and trying to figure out how to take better pictures or actually be able to get a good picture for putting into an insect ID app. When it comes to insect ID apps, I tested a whole bunch of different ones that were available. And basically, I have this scale of ones that are pretty good all the ways to ones that are pretty bad. Let's start with the one that's actually the best that I found, which is basically just using Google Lens. This had pretty accurate results, gave you a number of different things. It can show you a bunch of different pictures you compare stuff to. It's also free. So overall, if you're going to use anything, I would highly recommend trying to use Google Lens. There's another two options. One is Visual Lookup, which is basically available only on iPhones and is a built-in feature. And then there's Picture Insect, which is a paid app. Both of these are decent. They're definitely not too bad. They do provide a little bit of false certainty where it'll tell you sort of a species name when the app maybe didn't quite have enough information to say that. But overall, they're both pretty good and they're a decent starting place. So if you have an iPhone, you basically have that built in, or if you want something else, like, an app that you might have to purchase, Picture Insect also isn't too bad. We also have Seek by iNaturalist. It's not great, but it is free. And additionally, I really liked it because it didn't provide false certainty. If it didn't know what the insect was, it would not tell you it is something down to a species level. It would really hedge its bets and sort of only give you the most broad and general of answers if it wasn't sure what the insect actually was. So it's not bad, but it is free, and it's also really not going to lead you astray. And the final end of this, there are other insect ID apps that are actively bad, such as Insect Identifier. This got every single thing I put into it wrong, even really obvious things that it should have been able to figure out. And it also was the most expensive option that I had. So basically never use that one, but instead use something more like, say, Google Lens. Now, if you are using things like this, you should only ever be using them as a starting point to learn more, and you shouldn't be relying on these results, especially for any management decisions you might be happening to make. And additionally, sometimes these will give you pretty specific results. Don't trust those too much either. The more general it is, generally speaking, the better it is. If it's taking you down to a species, it can be a little bit tricky. So overall, be skeptical when using these because these are useful tools, but they are not reliable identifiers except in very specific circumstances. So always take it with a grain of salt, and of course, always double check any results you get, especially if it's coming down to trying to identify pests you have out in the field. Okay, so there's a very sort of condensed version of a bunch of different stuff for both magnifiers and insect ID apps. But once you know what your insect is, you also will need to be going out there and checking for it. And for that, we're getting into the scouting section. So for the basics of going out and scouting, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. One is you want to have a plan beforehand. You want to be consistent with all this because consistency truly is key. You're going to be keeping notes the entire time. You also need to know how you'll be using that scouting information beforehand. And once you've done all of this, you want to be doing it repeatedly and especially after treatment. And we're going to go into each one of these right now. So for the scouting basics, what do we mean by having a plan beforehand? It varies a lot by pest and it varies a lot by situation, but you really need to keep in mind what is it that works for your crop, for the pest that you're going to be potentially encountering, and also what works with your available time and labor. And the point of all this is that you need to be able to gather information that you need to decide when to actually treat or when to take control measures. So as an example, if you have lygus bugs in strawberry versus say lygus bugs in celery or lettuce, you're more likely to do something like more intensive sampling like beet sampling in strawberry because there's a very low threshold for lygus bugs there and they're very likely to show up. So you're going to have more intensive sampling, and the crop also allows for something like beet sampling where you're tapping the plants over a sheet and then counting how many lygus bugs there are. In things like celery or lettuce where beet sampling isn't going to be as useful and also the threshold for lygus bugs is a bit higher, doing sweep net sampling or just going out there and visually looking, checking and seeing if these lygus bugs are flying around can oftentimes be enough. So it just depends on your crop, the situation, and the pest, what exactly works the best. Now, in both cases, the threshold is low, but for strawberry, lygus bugs are much more certain to show up, and additionally, they're a much sort of more damaging pest in that situation. Once you have that plan beforehand, you figured out what you're going to do, consistency is very, very important. You can always adapt what your sampling plan looks like, but for the most part, if you keep it consistent, that's when you're going to see the best results. So you need to be scouting regularly, ideally every week or more, and as much as possible, stick with the same methods and tools throughout, because this allows you to track trends, it allows you to track the pest distribution, and it allows you to directly compare between one point in time to another. So as an example, let's say you're going out there and checking for spider mites, and you're visually checking 10 random plants per crop that you have for spider mites every week. You'll then estimate the number that you have per plant, and you do this consistently. Then you can compare spider mite populations even across different crops, across different times of year, across years, and you get a much better idea of what's actually happening. So let's have a plan beforehand and being consistent. Next, of course, is you need to keep notes. And this is something that is extremely important, and the better your notes are, the better off you're going to be. This is very simple. It's just a matter of keeping track of what happens and when in a reliable, consistent way that you can go back and check later. Because this will help you track outbreaks, it'll help you track the pest distributions, and you can also know which crops are being affected by the pests. And overall, this is going to help you manage the current pests you have, and also will help you prevent future ones because you know what's likely to be happening in the years coming up. Next, you need to know how you're going to be using all of this scouting information. That's to say that you need to determine beforehand what will trigger you to be applying insecticides, to be applying additional treatments, or things like that. So you need to figure out basically a rough economic threshold. And this is something that's really standard in IPM. Basically, on this graph on the y-axis, we have the number of different pests on your crop. On the x-axis, we have time. And you can see this pest population sort of building up, and it suddenly starts growing until it reaches the dotted line. The dotted line is the economic threshold. And basically what the economic threshold is the point at which you want to apply treatment to avoid reaching the economic injury level. And the economic injury level is just basically when you're actually losing some of your crops, when you're actually being damaged by the pest. So basically you treat at the economic threshold to avoid having your crops actually receive damage that reduces their yield or harms your bottom line. So as an example, in some situations for young cucurbits, there might be only one cucumber beetle per plant, and that's your economic threshold because they can cause quite a bit of damage. So at that point, you say, okay, I'm going to start treating to try to knock back cucumber beetle numbers before this starts to reach the economic injury level. So again, basically the idea of this is that know when you can tolerate damage and know when it is when you need to treat to not have it harm your bottom line. And finally, after all this, the last part of scouting is sort of do it again after treatment. It's not just once and done, it's a whole cycle that's being done over and over again. Because scouting isn't just to determine when to treat, it's also going to be there to let you know what treatments worked for you in your particular context. This is especially important for small-scale diversified cropping systems where a lot of the information that's out there is more tailored to large growers. And so knowing what works specifically in your system, which is going to be a little bit different and oftentimes not a monoculture, is going to be extremely important. This is also really important because for so many people, pest management is frequently done by feel, where they don't sort of have hard numbers, just kind of an overall sense of pest pressure and an overall sense of what is working. Now, that oftentimes can work for people, but oftentimes it doesn't work particularly well. And additionally, even when it does work, if there's not this sort of consistent pattern and good data, it will oftentimes mean that people are wasting time and they're wasting their resources. So going out there, scouting again, and gathering that same information after you treat is extremely useful. It'll narrow down the list of what works and what doesn't. It allows you to eliminate treatments that aren't being helpful for you. And overall, it's going to make your management much more effective and efficient. So as an overall sort of example of what monitoring and scouting might look like, say, in lettuce. Again, you're checking your plants, you're keeping notes, and this is taken from the UCIPM website, where this is a field that's about 40 to 80 acres. So for some of you, this may be a pretty relevant example. For some, it might be far too large. But the same kind of principles will still apply. It just depends on how you modify it to your scale. So if you have a pretty big field of lettuce, you're going to divide that field into quadrants. And for each one of the quadrants, you're going to select 5 locations, and then you're going to examine 5 plants per location. And basically what this is that, so you sort of will more randomly sample and get a better idea of what's happening across your entire field without having to sample every single plant inside your field. So quadrants, 5 locations per quadrant, 5 plants per location. And on each of those 25 plants per quadrant, you're going to be looking for things like armyworms, for loopers, for aphids, for leaf miners, for other different pests that might be present. So in total, you're going to be looking at 100 plants. And you're going to be doing this ideally, say, twice a week from germination to head formation. But again, it depends on what you have available in terms of labor and time. But twice a week would be ideal. When you're doing this, you're then keeping track of the trends. You get to know if your pests are uniformly distributed all throughout your field, or if they're patchy, just in one section more than another. Maybe one quadrant has an infestation much worse than another. Maybe they're closer to the edge in one section, or maybe they're closer to the center in another. You also can know about natural enemies, so what different beneficial predators are out there that could potentially be helping you manage your pests. Again, scout again after treatment to see how the pests react. So it's not just going through when you're growing, but also when you're actively applying treatment. And if done well, this type of monitoring and consistent scouting is going to be one of your most powerful tools when it comes to pest management. That was probably the thing we spend the most amount of time on, but let's get to the other parts of the IPM pyramid, which includes cultural control, prevention, and sanitation. So for this, one kind of note about this is that there's a lot of different terms that can apply in this section, things like cultural control, physical control, mechanical control, environmental control. I personally don't find that to be very useful, although that's oftentimes shown in a lot of different textbooks or things like that. I prefer to sort of lump them all together and use cultural control as a catch-all. So just note that that's what I'm doing here. I've separated out prevention and sanitation because I think they're often used as terms on their own and are pretty descriptive. But keep that in mind. So when I say cultural control, prevention, and sanitation, it's lumping a whole bunch of potential terms together as well. So these are really basic, but oftentimes powerful tools that are extremely useful to use. I'm just going to go over a very brief overview of a lot of these different things. But generally speaking, when we're talking about cultural control and things like that, it's about planting things like resistant cultivars or plants that are best suited to the region. So that'll help reduce the incidence of disease. It can also help reduce the number of pests and the amount of damage that they're causing to the different things that you're planting. Additionally, for sanitation, you want to be removing infested material or different alternative hosts that may be harboring additional pests. So that may be weeds on the margin of your field, that may be infested plants in your field. Getting rid of it and getting it out of there is extremely important because that really can help prevent pest populations from sort of skyrocketing if you're not paying attention. There's a bunch of other things you can do, things like physically destroying pests. This is a great example where you till them in, hoe them, crush them. Stuff like this is basically impossible for pests to really adapt to, and so it's a really good way, if possible, to get rid of pests, and it's sort of an example of avoiding the Red Queen scenario entirely. There's other things like mulches that you can cover the ground with. There's plastic mulches, there's organic mulches, there's also things like reflective mulch, which can make it harder for insects and other things to find your plants. There's also trapping. You can use this for monitoring in many different ways, but you can also use mass trapping in a variety of different settings to help keep your plants safe. And of course, there's proper water and nutrient management as well, because proper water and nutrient management is also pest control. And a good example of this relates to a bunch of different types of spider mites that you may encounter. So this is a very basic example, but spider mites are almost always worst on water-stressed or dusty plants. So if you properly irrigate and keep your plants well watered and free of dust, this almost always reduces mites pretty significantly. So that's a really basic way where just proper water management and keeping your plants a little bit clean can help keep down a pest that oftentimes is quite damaging. So other ways of using cultural control, prevention, and sanitation, it's really important to know that these should be your primary tools, especially to start, because of course, an ounce of prevention is greater than a pound of cure. And a good example of this relates to managing weeds to prevent various different pests. So things like lygus bugs or also thrips. So weeds at the margins of fields, especially some that are flowering that both thrips and lygus bugs are attracted to, can harbor these pests, and then they can move into your adjacent crops and start causing damage. So what you should do oftentimes is not just monitor inside of your crop, but monitor these margins, these weedy areas for pests as well, and get a sense of, are these actually attracting things like thrips or lygus bugs? And then also, are those populations growing to a point where it might be problematic and they might be spilling over into your adjacent crop? And there's a number of things you can do about this. If possible, and you have the resources for it, you can sometimes remove those weeds entirely to try to prevent a buildup of these different pests. You might also strategically use these weeds as a trap crop. That could mean that you allow the pests to get to them, and then before they sort of turn into a more mobile phase, when say the lygus bugs are younger, you can strategically destroy it early in the season, basically knocking back a bunch of their numbers and keeping them from moving into your crop. You also can use those weeds to keep them alive and are a more attractive thing than your crop, and it keeps the pests from moving in because they're all being drawn into the weeds, which are a bit more attractive than whatever your crop is. Again, this depends on context if it works particularly well, but if done properly, it can seriously mitigate pest issues or in some cases prevent them entirely. So again, Context matters a lot for things like this, but understanding the biology of your pest, understanding they may be in weeds at the margin of your fields, and then knowing what to do about that, which is a really good example of using cultural control to help prevent pretty serious pest problems in your crops later on. All right. Moving quickly now on, we're going to go into biological control, which is using beneficial organisms both passively and actively. And there's a number of different tactics that you can use with this. Conservation biological control is basically promoting existing natural enemies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, because this is something that I think is very useful, especially in sort of small-scale organic diversified farming settings. There's also augmentative biocontrol, which is basically where you usually buy natural enemies, and then you release them out into the field, and they sort of act like in a similar way to you would as a pesticide, but these come out, they then eat a bunch of different pests that are there, and then oftentimes sort of disperse. There's also pathogens, which are much more like pesticides or conventional-ish pesticides, things that you can buy and that you can apply out in the field, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as well. And finally, there's also classical biological control. This is something that cannot be done by individuals, but is done by people at universities after conducting research, and then also in collaboration with governments. So this is basically where you bring in an exotic natural enemy to try to control usually an invasive pest, and it becomes established in the landscape. So basically bring in a new species to try to combat a species that is here as a pest. And a great example of this here in California is the Vidalia beetle, which was brought in to destroy cottony cushion scale, which was becoming a very serious and existential threat to the citrus industry at the time. But some of the ones that are going to be most useful, oftentimes for more small-scale diversified farmers, are things like biological control. And this is something I did my PhD research on, and I think is a particularly interesting one. So conservation biological control is very useful in these small farm contexts. And basically what you're doing is you're providing resources that these various beneficial organisms, these predators, parasitoids, and even pollinators need to survive in the landscape. So that's providing them with pollen, with nectar, with a stable source of habitat or source of alternative prey. And what that can often look like is establishing things like floral plantings or floral strips, either intercropped within your crops or on the sort of the margins of a field. So basically, there's a number of different ways to do this. You can increase plant diversity, and that's probably the best way. That can be by planting polycultures, which a lot of people on sort of a small scale are already doing, generally planting more natives, or as I talked about a little bit before, establishing those permanent floral plantings. Additionally, and sort of beyond just providing those resources, you want to limit disruptions as much as possible. So try not to disturb the soil unnecessarily if you can. Keep that habitat intact if you do provide it. And also, as much as possible, try to avoid broad spectrum sprays, because there are still broad spectrum sprays that can be used in organic agriculture, things like spinosad. Try to avoid those as much as possible, and certainly avoid using them where they may drift over, or you might be actively spraying these areas that are providing that source of habitat. What's also kind of neat about this is that these conservation biological control tactics pair well with pollinator or other conservation practices. So if you want to have something that's a floral planting benefiting pollinators or trying to benefit native organisms, they oftentimes will work well to promote beneficial parasitoids and predators and things like that. Now, it's important to note that this will usually provide a baseline level of control and sort of keep numbers down, but it can be difficult to manage existing outbreaks this way. So if you have a whole bunch of, say, aphids that are showing up, don't expect you planting flowers right away to then sort of knock their numbers back. You usually have to do something else. This is something that you do passively that then helps provide that baseline level of control, but it's not something that you sort of do actively to try to manage things once they're already happening. But it is a very, very useful thing to keep in mind, and is especially useful in those diversified small-scale settings. You also have a number of different pathogens that are available. These can be commercially bought, and there's a lot of different options. Bacillus thuringiensis is a very, very common one that is very commonly used throughout agriculture. It's a soil-dwelling bacterium and can be used very effectively against a lot of different types of insect larvae. So different flies, different moths, so caterpillars and stuff like that, and also a number of different beetles can be affected by BT or Bacillus thuringiensis. We also have different entomopathogenic fungi like Bavaria bassiana or Aesaria, again, commercially available. These can target a whole number of different things depending on the different strains you have. So aphids, whiteflies, thrips, weevils, like the one pictured up here. Again, the different strains will be used to target different pests and can be, again, very, very effective when used appropriately. There's also a number of different entomopathogenic nematodes. There's the Heterohybididea and Sternonematidae. Both of these, again, commercially available, and they tend to target soil-dwelling pests. So different things that are under the ground, like, say, fungus gnats or weevils, or different life stages of thrips that are underground. that's when the nematodes work particularly well on them. These are all really good options, and these are things that you should definitely keep in mind because they work very well with organic agriculture. But there's a couple things that are important about these. You need to be more aware of temperature and humidity because these are living organisms, and oftentimes they require higher humidity and not particularly high temperatures in order to work. So definitely be reading any instructions you have with these and definitely be following them, because I've seen multiple people who try to utilize these but aren't really following the directions, and it doesn't work particularly well. And additionally, while this is a better option than relying on more conventional insecticides or things like that to manage pests, there is no reason that pests cannot also develop resistance to things like this if this is the only thing you're using. So don't think just because it's biological control and these are pathogens that it doesn't mean that pests can potentially evolve resistance to it. Don't rely just on a single form of control, even if it is something like these. All right, so last part of the IPM pyramid is chemical control, because of course pesticides are a part of integrated pest management too. This is something that I'm sure all of you have lots of different information about different organic pesticides that are available, so I'm not going to go very much into it, but they certainly can be effective and highly useful. A number of different ones: azadirect and insecticidal soap, pyrethrins, spinosad, which very, very common. Lots of people use that one in particular. And of course, they should be options to use as control measures, but would not be your only or even your main tool as much as possible. Because again, you don't want to just be practicing conventional agriculture with your hands tied because you have fewer options. What's important to note is that these certainly can be used alongside with predators or parasitoids, either if you're releasing them yourself or if you have things like conservation biocontrol where they're naturally entering into your crops. And here's a useful table. It's from the UC IPM website, which is basically showing a number of different insecticides and then showing their relative toxicity to both parasitoids and predators, both directly and then also as a residual. And so you'll kind of note the things that'll be useful in organic ag. You have the microbials, botanicals, oils, and then also things like spinosad. Most of them, especially residually, are pretty good, where they aren't going to be continuing to harm beneficial organisms for a while. But a lot of them, if directly applied onto the beneficial organisms that are there, will still kill them. So this is really important to note because yes, you can use these. They can be used in conjunction with predators and parasitoids, but many of them still can be harmful, and it is really important to keep that in mind. So timing and knowledge of both the pest and the beneficials really are key, especially if you're using things like spinosad, which can harm bees, and it can harm a number of different pretty important biological control agents. So really do keep that in mind. But generally speaking, of course, these are much better than some of the conventional insecticides. And what's also important is that they don't tend to have a long residual. So after you've used them, generally speaking, it's pretty much safe for lots of different other organisms to come in. Although again, not in every scenario. And we'll talk a little bit about one or two of those later on. So that's basically what we have for organic pesticides. Again, there's tons of information out there, and it's probably the most readily accessible to use, so I won't spend much time on that. The last part of the IPM pyramid that's sort of overarching all of this is the idea of shifting your perspective. And when I talk about shifting your perspective, there's three main things that, if possible, it's really important to do to practice good pest management. And that is thinking holistically and ecologically. It's biasing yourself more towards inaction, and it's also adjusting your expectations of what should be. And we'll talk a little bit more about these in depth. So when I say thinking holistically or ecologically, this is really important in IPM because quote unquote real IPM and really effective pest management really is about thinking holistically, because everything is connected and each thing you do will affect something else, and oftentimes in ways that you might not expect if you don't have good knowledge of the system. So you need to consider many different factors and interactions, and you need to consider how these control measures will interact and affect other things. And a really good example of this where thinking ecologically and holistically is really important is, say, for ants and ant management. So ants will protect different sap-sucking pests from natural enemies. So things like the aphids on the dragon fruit flower in the background. Ants will protect those from parasitoids and predators and make it so that they'll persist, and you won't be able to have good effective biological control even if it would normally be working. The ants will protect them. So you then put out things like ant baits. And this is a really good example of targeted chemical control, which really only goes to the ants, that enhances and in fact enables biological control. So there's different ways where you have to be able to use different techniques in combination in order to achieve a more desirable outcome or to make things like biological control work. So you might be in a situation where you think, yes, I'm going to manage these through biocontrol, but if you're not thinking holistically or ecologically, you might miss something that in fact prevents that. So it is really important to keep in mind. Additionally, as much as you can, try to bias yourself more towards inaction. This isn't always the case because it's important to know when to act and when not to, but it is very important to not intervene just because you see a pest. Again, remember that idea about trying to treat at the economic threshold and really not before. The pest population can be there and it won't be damaging you necessarily until a certain point, and that's when you need to treat. So try to bias yourself a little bit more towards inaction. And as much as possible, it's better to wait, to observe, and to learn because we're predisposed to act. And oftentimes, if we just sat there and watched a little bit more, it would be extremely useful. If your system is well designed and in balance, the problem will often resolve itself with more minimal damage. Again, this isn't always the case, but it's a good way to also check to see if you're doing a good job trying to avoid that red queen scenario. Because if you did your job right, action is frequently not needed, and you have, in fact, avoided the red queen scenario. But that brings us to the last part of sort of shifting your perspective, and that's about adjusting your expectations as much as possible, because growers really do frequently live in that red queen scenario, constantly running and constantly doing as much as they can just to maintain the status quo. This is partially because farming is in many ways inherently unnatural. You have very high concentrations of single plants together. Even if you have diversified cropping systems, this is still very different than what would normally be found in nature. And because of that, it's sort of fundamentally unnatural. It does mean that you're trying to maintain a sort of artificial system, which can be difficult to do without having frequent additional inputs. So as much as you can, and again, this is if possible, try to consider changing your expectations. This may or may not be possible depending on market demands or who's buying your produce or things like that. But if you can accept some more damage, let a bit more disorder come in, and let your system balance itself more, this can be a very effective way to practice more sustainable IPM, because fundamentally, you can't maintain an unnatural system without continually putting in your own inputs and time consistently. So if you can have a little bit more damage or a little bit more imperfect produce or things like that, then it's much easier to practice good IPM and have systems where you don't constantly need to be putting in inputs just to keep pest numbers at a low enough level where there's no cosmetic damage to your produce. Again, this varies a lot by situation, and you might not be able to do this for very reasonable market reasons, but if you can, it is fundamentally quite important to sustainable integrated pest management. Okay, that's the entire IPM pyramid. Let's go through a couple examples really quickly of sort of using all of these together. So if you say have thrips in your crop, what would be kind of using all the steps in conjunction? Well, first off, you're monitoring consistently. As a general rough threshold, if you're finding maybe 5 to 10 thrips per sticky card that you've put out per week, then you might consider having to do some additional treatment. You also want to know what your thrips are. Are they Western flower thrips? Are they onion thrips? Are they something else? Because if you know that, then you will then know their life cycle and how best to tailor different control strategies to them. So deploy sticky cards, check for signs of damage, go out there, be looking at your plants on a regular basis. As much as possible, you want to be implementing cultural controls, like if you can, maybe you have floating row covers, maybe you have reflective mulch that will help prevent the thrips from finding your plants. Practicing good sanitation if there's highly damaged or infested plants or weeds that might be acting as alternative hosts and bringing the thrips in. Try to get rid of those, get rid of infested material. In most cases, try to promote plant and insect biodiversity to try to keep a good pool of predators and parasitoids present, because they will help keep thrips numbers down. And then if they do show up, biological control can be a good first option for intervention. There's a number of different predatory mites that you can purchase and release. You can apply different entomopathogenic fungi like Bavaria bassiana, and there's other things, some of these nematodes, which are effective, especially as soil drenches, to kill off thrips pupae living in the soil. If you are doing this, you want to be applying them pretty early and use multiple options at the same time, because it does require more upfront effort, but certainly can be highly effective and also can even entirely replace more conventional insecticides. That being said, you also certainly can treat with insecticides if need be. If you are going to be doing this, try to rotate through different modes of action. So say doing spinosad, then azadirect, and then pyrethrins, and apply those insecticides twice, about 5 to 7 days apart, before rotating to a different mode of action, which will help prevent these insects from developing resistance. Another example that might show up is, say, aphids in lettuce. So make sure you'll be able to ID what aphids look like, and also some of the signs of damage that they have, which is potentially sooty mold or having these more stunted or distorted plants. You want to be monitoring for aphids pretty regularly, about 1 to 2 times a week. And also keep in mind that aphids can cluster together, and they're also oftentimes more likely to appear at the edges of fields. So check a good number of plants. If you're dividing your field up into quadrants, 25 per quadrant, and make sure you're checking a number of different places, both in the edge and also further in as well. Oftentimes, natural biological control can do a good job of keeping some of these different aphid numbers in check. So there's green lacewings, there's parasitoids, there's syrphid fly larvae. This example on the right-hand side is an aphid that has been parasitized, has a little parasite growing inside of it. So it's been killed and will soon grow into a wasp that will fly out and go infest more aphids. This is a really good way of sort of having natural pest control. And you can put up things like banker plants to promote these. In some cases, things like sweet alyssum, but you can also have more perennial plantings. And these are pretty good for bringing in these really common natural enemies like green lacewings, parasitoids, and syrphid flies, like the ones pictured down below, which can be effective pollinators. And then also their larvae on the right-hand side will feed on aphids pretty voraciously. If these aphids are still a problem, as a general rough threshold, maybe about 20 aphids per larger plant, you might need to actually be applying different insecticides. So things like azadirachtin, insecticidal soaps, or Bavaria bassiana can be effective, but you have to also remember that some of the things that we tend to think of as being effective in lots of cases, like spinosad, aren't going to be useful in this situation. Spinosad does not work very well against aphids. It's not labeled for use against them in most cases. And also, spinosad is directly harmful towards these syrphid flies. So it has been found to kill both the adults and also the larvae, which normally will help keep your aphid numbers in check. So again, understanding the interactions between the different insecticides you might use and the beneficial natural enemies that are there are also really important. Another example, if you have things like cabbage looper present in different cole crops, first off, be able to identify all stages of loopers. So you can see their eggs, some of the adults, and then also the larvae pictured down below. You want to be monitoring soon after seeding or transplanting, sort of similar to the aphids, checking, say, 25 plants, except in this case, randomly throughout the field, looking both for the loopers and for their damage as well. As general rough thresholds per 5 young plants, maybe it's 1 looper because they can cause a bit more damage. For more established plants, they can usually tolerate a bit more damage, about 9 loopers per plant. And then at harvest, a little bit less, where if there's about 10% of your plants are infested, you might want to consider some additional form of treatment. You want to be managing nearby weeds like mustard, which could be harboring these pests and then moving into your field. And you also will keep in mind that natural enemies will oftentimes keep their populations down. So try to avoid these broad spectrum insecticides as much as possible and allow those beneficial predators to come in and keep them a bit more in check. If you are reaching that kind of threshold, BT applications can be effective, but generally speaking, they work a little bit better on younger larvae. And if those aren't working, spinosad can be used, but again, it also tends to be more effective for smaller larvae, but also will affect other caterpillars that may be present out there. All right, I think I've got one more example, which is say with cucumber beetles attacking your different cucurbits. So it's important to be able to identify the different life stages and also some of the different species, because there are a number of different ones that may be present. You want to be monitoring soon after seeding or transplanting, and it's kind of a rough threshold, although it does certainly vary by different varieties. For younger plants where they're a little bit more vulnerable, it might be as low as 1 cucumber beetle per plant. But again, it depends on the crop. Winter squash can sometimes be a little bit hardier and at least can tolerate more defoliation when they're younger. But again, it depends on if you're more worried about them damaging the younger plants or if you're more worried about them damaging the rind of the different cucurbits that you're growing. As much as possible, consider maybe planting less susceptible varieties if these things are a consistent problem in your area. And additionally, transplants will usually do a little bit better than direct seeding, and mulching, whether that's like organic mulch like straws or things like that, or more plastic mulch, can also help promote predators. Generally speaking, things like organic mulch, straw, wood chips, or things like that is better at promoting these different predators. Also, it's been found that interplanting the cucurbits with other crops oftentimes reduces pest pressure, but be careful if you're doing that with something like corn, since spotted cucumber beetle also can feed on corn and might be moving from corn over onto your cucurbits. But generally speaking, interplanting with other crops definitely does reduce cucumber beetle pressure. You can also put up floating row covers to prevent the cucumber beetles from finding young plants to begin with. Again, you have to remove this for pollination, but it is a good way to keep their numbers down, especially on younger plants. There is some parasitism from flies and wasps that help keep the cucumber beetles down, and there are some predators that eat them, but overall, it usually doesn't provide particularly great levels of control. So other things you can do when it comes to chemical control, you can use preventative applications of kale and clay. You can also do applications of pyrethrins, some spinosad, or also chromobacterium. Okay, sorry, someone just started talking. But there's also, this is the active ingredient in Grandivo, might also work and help keep their numbers down as well. So with all this in mind, when you use all these steps in combination, it really does help prevent the Red Queen scenario. It's much more effective than just spraying. And ultimately, to do this effectively, you need to become an expert in your own system. So the very last thing is, where do you find more information? The best place I'd recommend is going to the UCIPM website. The website is listed there, but if you also look up UCIPM, you'll find it right away. There's two different sections. There's sort of homes and landscape versus agriculture. So know where you are. Obviously, one is more tailored to agriculture, one is more tailored to home gardening. Depending on your scale, both may be applicable. So if you're more of a small farmer, you might want to check both of them out. And they certainly both have relevant information, even on the same pests. So how to manage them in, say, your homes and gardens versus how to manage them in an agricultural scenario. Here is what the UCIPM website will look at if you go to the agricultural section, where there's a whole bunch of different crops. You can then click on them and get detailed information per crop, things like a year-round IPM program, things to do at different times of the year, a whole bunch of general info, as well as a lot of individual pages on individual pests, including arthropods, diseases, and weeds. So this is a really, really great resource, and I highly recommend you check that out for any of the different things that you may be dealing with. Especially if you are in a more diversified situation, you can look up a whole bunch of different information and start compiling it together for yourself. And with that, I've gone a little bit long for sure, but if there's any questions, my email is down here, and then also down below is the UCIPM website as well. And thank you very much for your attention.